Miguel, what do Teletubbies and babies remind you of?
What do Teletubbies and babies remind me of? It reminds me of a very core foundational memory in my life. Um, I was 4 years old, give or take, a few months. And my mom couldn't find like somebody to watch me for the day. So she decided to do a take your kid at work day. And basically I found myself in an operating room of basically an OR delivery. Um,
As one does. As one does.
As one does, just really casually, just out there. And I was in an observational room, and there was a window into the goings on of the event. And I remember very distinctly there was a television set, one of those really old, old now like Super Lark TVs, like those huge and chonky, right above the what we call it, the window. It was playing Teletubbies while a baby was being delivered out of a woman. And I remember very distinctly the Teletubbies baby, the son character was flashing out while the child was being held in my mother's hands as she successfully delivered a child into this world. And that is what Teletubbies and babies remind me of.
We all have foundational memories. Welcome back to How It's Met, the podcast where we chat with people shaping the future of healthcare and health tech. Here we interview founders, investors, VC, and your occasional, and this time around, VP Engineering of an amazing startup in the clinical trials world, so that you too can get a better understanding of the stories, secrets, and skills of those shaping the world of healthcare around you. We do this so that you can better understand how you can shape the lives of those around you for the better. This time around, we've got Miguel Testa, VP Engineering of Vial, a global full-service CRO based in San Fran that aims to reimagine clinical trials to deliver dramatically faster, more efficient trials for biotech sponsors. Miguel, how are you doing?
Doing fantastic. How about you guys?
I'm doing all right.
Yeah, let's hear how this goes. So tell us about your journey into engineering. How'd that start?
So it started when, well, first and foremost, I went into UBC. I did this thing called pre-med engineering because, again, owing to my experience, foundational memory, watching an OR with Teletubbies in the background, I've always wanted to be a doctor. I've always wanted to be a physician. That's been a dream of mine since I was young. But um, as I was going through my education at UBC, one thing I realized is that the pathway to medicine, the pathway to becoming a physician here in Canada, was not something that I particularly resonated with. And furthermore, the realities of being a physician here in Canada was not necessarily something that was aligned with my personal values, with how I wanted to approach medicine. And that led me to look at what else am I good at? And I kind of, gravitated naturally towards computers and programming. I've been monkeying around on, computers and software since I was young and trying to get like bootleg games to work on my PC. And that kind of germinated into this whole thing about, programming in university and being pretty decent at it. And I just chased that down and found myself where I am.
How'd you end up joining the organization?
I ended up joining the organization because the CEO, Simon, ended up reaching out to me, and basically painting me the story of this biotech that he's shaping. I think it's an important piece of context that, again, I did biomedical engineering. I came out of the program not expecting at all to jump into anything medical related or pharma related, or anything that has to do with my degree. But yeah, the opportunity arose when Simon messaged me and said, "Hey, I'm building this biotech. Do you want in?" It was almost like serendipity that I got the opportunity to kind of jump back into this thing that I've been interested in all my life, and in the skills and capacity that I kind of built towards that moment.
Out of curiosity, then, what made you so interested in the entrepreneurial path?
So, what made me interested in the entrepreneurial side of things? Um, so again, like the initial interest came out of necessity. I needed to forge my own path to be able to pursue what I found interesting at the time. Um, but I think what's the most interesting about the entrepreneurial path is that you're in full control of, I guess, your own destiny. I know it sounds very cliche, but there's a lot to be said about limiting the factors that kind of shape your decisions on a day-to-day basis. And I think as an entrepreneur, as a business owner, um, it's almost the penultimate, manifestation of being in control of your own career.
With the journey into Vial, you shared with me some really interesting, I guess, reading about the company in itself. Long story short, Vial does super interesting things with regard to integrating the different technologies that are necessary to abide by the regulations of clinical trials in, I guess, North America
Mhm.
overall. But Miguel, do you mind, I guess, paraphrasing that in a means or in a way that a 5-year-old could understand?
Yeah. So clinical trials are really expensive in large part because people still use pen and paper all over the world in order to record data and other very inefficient things. When people do inefficient things, again, like use pen and paper, fly out in order to inspect clinical trial sites, uh, basically not check their data using, programmatic methods or like using computers, you end up having to redo a lot of work. You end up having to wait for a lot of people to respond to emails or kind of just even land and inspect a clinical trial. So all of these inefficiencies, all of these things that that slow things down, if you get rid of it, if you make it more efficient by using computers and using modern tools and using the internet and the cloud in order to store your data, to manage your data more effectively, what you actually end up with is radically cheaper and more efficient trials. So again, to paraphrase that really, really simply, the way clinical trials broken because people do very, very slow things.
So, what kind of engineering would you classify this as? Because it doesn't really fall into my numbskull and like understanding of what specialties of engineering there are. Is this like systems engineering, or how would you best describe it?
So it's really all of the above, right? So obviously like being able to architect a system and how it fits with, things like EHR systems, like existing electronic health record systems. How does it fit in with the regulations that, the FDA and other kind of regulatory bodies enforce when it comes to security, privacy, and, integrity of data? That's huge. How do you interface with clinical trial sites, with how their staff are trained, how do you onboard them, how do you like keep your service alive like a traditional software problem. So there's a lot of systems in play. There's a lot of software in play because clearly you're building software. There's data engineering there because you're having to map out the data flow of it all. And there's also a little bit of biomedical engineering because a big part of your job, or at least our job here at Vial, is to make sure that medical forms are properly configured. So there's a lot of like instinct there where it's like, okay, like, you know, this is measuring blood pressure. Like, should it have a value of like 10,000? No, it shouldn't. Right? Like there's things like that that have to be relied on with an instinct of somebody who's aware of medicine.
Tell me about it. It's painful.
All right. Can you tell us a bit about how you approached the problem when you first joined Vial?
So approaching the problem when I first joined Valve, first off, is it is a very broad problem space. Clinical trials and drug development as a whole from end to end is an extremely deep and also wide problem. So the first thing was drinking off a fire hose. Um, you guys are in the medical industry. There's so many acronyms. There's like, just a litany of acronyms that you have to be aware of that people use on like in a day-to-day basis. Honestly, I'm blanking right now with a good acronym. Ideally, I'd be rattling up some like really gnarly acronyms about all things clinical trials. But yeah, it's all about drinking off fire hose. And the first thing is to be a listener and to be a learner, right? I would estimate, and this is a spiel I give to everyone in Vial, it took me about 9 months to feel comfortable that with the fact that I'm in the clinical trials world. That's how much information was being thrown at you and trying to get into this world. Um, but yeah, basically again, it's all about being a listener first, being a learner first, and making sure that you know what you're walking into as you start making these design decisions and these engineering decisions. And as I started kind of like seeing and mapping out the problem space a little bit more intimately, I feel as I became more comfortable with the whole world of clinical trials, I started approaching it from, and this would be actually really interesting because the best way to make good clinical trial software fast is almost to be unempathetic. It's almost actually not think about how users are using your software, but rather where the data is going to go to. Let me explain more clearly. The end users of the software are clinical trial sites, but the end beneficiaries are actually the patients, right? So between those two, right, between the needs and the security of the patient and the ease of use of your clinical trial sites, which do you prioritize, right? And this is where it becomes unique from a software and product development perspective, right? I'll give you a very tangible example, right? One of our big security features, for HIPAA and GDPR is you need to log people out after about 15 minutes of use. A lot of clinical trial sites obviously find that very annoying and all, because then they have to do like two-factor authentication. They'd be like, oh, why do I have to log in over and over again? But the thing is, like you have to make sure that the patient's data is secure. Because obviously it's their health, it's their privacy at stake. There's a lot on the line there. So, who do you prioritize? Do you make it easier for your end user, who is the clinical trial site, to use, or do you secure the patient's data? And when you start applying that kind of framework of like, okay, there's many layers of stakeholders here, right? You kind of like remove yourself from the situation of developing the product and think more holistically about like, okay, how does the data flow? How do we make sure the data gets from point A to point B securely, efficiently, and without any hassle? Obviously, we want to make the system very easy to use for our, end users, which again, clinical trial sites. But ultimately, again, the patient does take precedence. The security of the data does take precedence, and moving it from point A to point B is the whole point. As a last point, the last interesting tidbit here is that clinical trials and the products and software around it is literally just moving data from point A to point B. It's literally just moving the data from your patient's, statements and their writing into a report. That's it. It's actually a fundamentally simple problem with not so simple obstacles.
I'm a bit curious about the obstacles.
So the obstacles of making good clinical trial software, again, first and foremost, is your regulations. So regulatory bodies obviously clamp down and make sure that your data is secure and that your work is well validated. There's a lot of red tape, which again, it's for a good reason. You don't want anyone to just be able to store patient data in something that's completely unsecured. The other challenge is that it's hard to get feedback. It's hard to get user feedback when you're building software for the clinical trial stage, because the sales cycle, the adoption is like very, very slow. It's not like you build something and all of a sudden it's in the hand of users. Obviously, we did some workarounds and hacks around getting user feedback, meaning like dry run testing it, a lot of experimentation, just a lot of people just doing, like using our products in a dry run fashion. But nothing beats when rubber meets the road, right? Like nothing beats the real thing. And again, in the biomedical industry, the biopharma industry, the biotech industry, that's quite a long cycle to get there. So that is a very, very big challenge that I think is starting to become it's being overcome now by a few different methods.
You're working as someone who's leading a team of so many different specialists in their own subspecific fields, biologists, biochemists, chemists. How do you manage to keep on top of managing such a diverse team that is such subspecific knowledge that you can't really learn the entirety of?
Yeah, definitely. So it's really, really hard at first. I think the first time you make a hire or you're in charge of leading somebody who's outside of your realm of expertise, there's almost this stage fright. There's almost this the imposter syndrome all of a sudden flares up in the strongest ways. And that's for good reason. Again, it's another expert, somebody who's clearly smarter than you and much better than you at one aspect of your industry or your job. So there's a lot at play here. So I think the first thing to consider is really throw away your ego. Check your ego at the door. Actually, don't even just check your ego at the door. Make sure you don't even bring it with you on the way to work, because you turn into a noob every time you speak to this person and they're reporting to you. You just don't a lot of times they'd be speaking and you don't know. And there's a strong temptation to just pretend it's like, yeah, I totally get that. Right. Like, oh, like, that thing, I absolutely know what you're talking about. Um, but no, you can't do that. We
How
actually
many
need to
times have you played it cool though, Miguel? How many times have you actually played it cool?
realistically, actually, I'm going to be 100% real here. I probably play it cool about 30% of the time.
Okay,
30%,
okay, okay.
30% of the
Respectable.
time, 30% of the time, I would pretend that I actually know what I was talking about. But over the year or so that I've been in charge of like cross-disciplinary teams,
Yeah.
that number has slowly started down and down and down. And a way to actually, this is a tip to all of you who are listening, who may find yourself in a position where you don't know what they're talking about, and and you don't understand, and you're afraid of looking stupid, but you also need to understand. The magic question to say, or the magic prompt to say, is, can you summarize that in a couple of sentences? Ask them to like re-summarize everything that they said in a couple of sentences. And usually, if you did your hiring well, if you were surrounded by really, really good people, they would usually explain it in very basic terms that you would understand, or at least you would get the context clues of what they're trying to say. Because a lot of times, and this is again goes for any expert, it could be software, it could be mechanical, it could be biomedical, it could be in data engineering, it could be in biostatistics or even chemistry. And like every single like technical expert loves talking on and on about technical details. It's all about, the nuances of their work, what makes their work very uniquely technical and special, but quite often the impact of it to the project or to the business as a whole could be summarized in a couple sentences. So again, if you don't understand what your technician is telling you, tell them, hey, explain this to me in a couple of sentences, and that will work well. So that's one. Next important thing when managing people who are outside of your realm of expertise, beyond obviously checking your ego at the door, being willing to learn, getting them to, explain things very well to you or very briefly to you, is to be really, really good at diagramming. Diagramming is probably the most essential skill of somebody who's managing a different set of, expertise. And let me tell you why. The reason why is because every single process, every single function that any technical person does can be boiled down to really a flowchart. You can break every single technical process, every single technical project down to a flowchart. And if you could like draw it out in like a diagram of like, this is what happens, and this is what happens, and this is what happens, and this is what happens. If you're able to map everything out in a very clean diagram or flowchart, what you're then able to do is really narrow down what you don't understand in somebody's work. Like, for example, if my chemist, does a cool flowchart on drug discovery and, how he uses the software to basically figure out, drugs. It's a sequence of steps. Okay, like we get the data, we clean the data, we format the data, then we do this like really crazy simulation, and then we do another filtering of data. And this crazy simulation, I don't know what the hell it does. So what I then do is I highlight that thing on the flowchart, say, okay, this one block, this is the only thing I care about. Tell me about this. Elaborate about this. Because a lot of the things you can conceptually grasp. So again, being able to visualize things, being able to decompose things into a step-by-step linear, ideally linear flowchart, goes a long way towards understanding things that you just generally wouldn't have any idea with. And I think with just those two, those are the 80-20. Like just be willing to listen, be willing to learn, and get good at visualizing processes. Those two things get you a long way towards managing anyone. Like right now, I wouldn't be surprised if you guys could manage a literal nuclear scientist or like a rocket scientist at the same time if you're just able to follow those two steps. Not that you would, because, medicine, but I digress.
That would be terrifying. But I mean, either way, you backtracking a little, you dropped a little bit of a segue there when you talked about drug discovery. Vial has done pretty amazing work when it comes to simplifying the conduct of clinical trials. Again, by making sure that data is transferred efficiently from one site to another, because that's the whole complication about clinical trials. The next step that Vial took was in essentially drug discovery with its spin-off, Battery Bio. So can you tell us a little bit about the lowdown of the drug development scene that justifies this next big move from Vial?
Yeah. So to put quite simply, after we started optimizing clinical trials, or after we've seen the wonderful effects of what happens when your clinical trials are much, much more efficient. The next thing is, what do you do with, like, where do you go from there? Right. Again, one of the things I didn't bring up is our vision. Our vision as a startup was to really cure all human disease. Um, and, by optimizing clinical trials, we basically eliminated the biggest bottleneck in the whole drug development process. Right. But we're still not accelerating. Like, we've accelerated things by a lot, but it's not enough. It's not enough for us. I think we thought that we could do much better things if we own the whole process, right? Because imagine you've optimized the biggest bottleneck. What if you yourself bring those efficiencies upstream into the process, meaning earlier on in the process, when you're just discovering the drug, when you're just finding out your drug candidate? What if you own that part of the process too, and you could just control the pipe from A to B, right? Or A to Z. And I think that's why we got inspired. Like, hey, let's make our own drug. Let's formulate our own things. Let's figure out our own ways to discover drugs and put them through our own clinical trial process. Not only is it a lot more efficient, we could hypothetically really like walk through a whole bunch of different drugs, really, really quickly. And also, speaking from a less than altruistic statement, also make a lot of capital and make a lot of money doing that. So that was a huge driver for us to look into drug discovery.
Mhm. So I think the flip side of this question then becomes, why have the incumbents, so for example, your Novo Nordisk, and other like huge pharmaceutical giants, not invested in more software to ensure that their like tech stack is able to integrate all of the end-to-end preclinical, clinical, and post-marketing work in the way that Vial is trying to do.
Yeah. When you're dealing with something as fundamental as pharmaceuticals and medicine, there is always this instinct of, if it's not broken, why fix it? Right? Don't fix what isn't broken, which again, in a lot of cases is ideal, because you don't want people to be like messing around with fundamental processes that have to do with people's health. There's an inherent risk, is another way to phrase this. There is a risk to doing things new. And that risk, the industry is again, very averse to that. And it really takes somebody new, somebody who's, much, much early, like much, much earlier on in the life cycle of a company, to be able to stomach that risk, to be able to say, okay, you know what, we're going to do our own thing. We're going to say, we're going to revamp everything. We're going to use all the latest software, even though they're not 100%, field tested, not 100%, as tried and true as the old methods. We're going to use them and we're going to win. Again, that stomach for risk, that appetite for innovation, I think is what stops most incumbents from treading down this path.
What makes Vial so confident that they can tackle the space when the company doesn't have a background in biological insights itself?
So the question is, what makes us so confident given the absence of like biological insight? Is that the question?
Yeah, well, I mean, the fundamental basis of Vial, if I understand correctly, and correct me if I'm wrong, is that there's inefficiency in the transfer of data in the clinical trial system. That in itself is a very engineering problem. However, drug development requires understanding of receptors, ligands, bonding, I guess, probabilities. I'm no expert at this,
Mhm.
but Vial's starting ground is not in that realm. So why pivot to a realm where strengths do not necessarily lie?
But the strengths, okay, so this is the contrarian view, because the strengths actually do lie in there. Uh, Actually, let me pitch the softball actual response here. The softball actual response is, we actually do have biological expertise in the way of our scientific advisory board, although it is not the company expertise. That's I think a very important disclaimer to have. We're not just doing it live and just like hoping things work. There's actually some biological strategy here.
We're doing a
That
live voice.
yeah. That being said, our expertise as a company does not indeed lie in the biological forensics. So what makes us so confident? What AI and computational methods allow you to do fundamentally is actually turn these very, very scientific chemistry and biological problems into engineering problems. And let me explain why. So if you think about, let's stick with chemistry, right? Because it's easier to illustrate that. Chemicals can be expressed in strings. By strings, I mean, you could express chemicals as a series of letters. There is this system called SMILES, SMILES, and SMILES, which are a representation of a molecule or reactions in, out like just written form. When you have something like that, you're able to easily feed it into a computer and more specifically AI. Why is that relevant? Because what you're able to do with that is you're able to first turn that normal string into a 3D representation. You could simulate properties of it. You can ask your AI to predict its properties and basically, give digital readouts of it before it's even made. And instead of having to just look at your molecule and as a chemist say, oh, based on this structure, I could clearly see that this, this area right here is going to bond really well with the target ligand because of this chemical property. We could just ask the computer, hey, is this going to work or not? Right. And if you're able to multiply that across thousands, millions, or even billions of compounds that you're able to screen and you're able to ask AI to do some interpolation for you, you're able to turn this into a filtering problem rather than a like domain expertise insight problem. You're able to brute force your way into like lists or even like just lists of molecules and just like filter down, until you have something that looks good in silico, which is in the computer. And once you have something that's good in silico, that's when you test it in real life and you start getting your data readouts. And you could also like leverage a lot of the automated robotics and labs here in this technology. And you're able to like create a lot of chemicals. You're able to like synthesize them and test them at a rapid manner. So again, our big thesis is we have turned drug discovery into a primarily engineering problem. And again, I'll repeat this one more time. We do have obviously scientists like domain experts, chemists and biologists who help us figure out our targets, figure out our strategy, like give us a good science foundation. But the bulk of the work has been transformed into an engineering problem.
All right. That's an absolutely magnificent answer. I think that the next question then becomes, if Vial is doing so much work in integrating systems end to end to make drug discovery an engineering problem, as you say, one could say that you're vertically integrating the process and essentially owning the entire value chain of drug development. Why go this route if the industry trend is to outsource as much of the work as possible?
Yeah, and that's a big feedback we've been getting from everyone is that the vertical integration story is such a rebel story. It's such a such a contrarian story. The reality is, I think people are missing how much computers and AI are making it feasible to in-house things. And I think that, like, again, an adjacent piece of technology that's not quite in clinical trials or not quite in the pharma world is that I'd like to point out is your 3D printing, right? Like 3D printing, allows you to vertically integrate your up until prototyping stage, right? You're able to prototype your own mechanical devices or or like products without having to outsource your prototyping function. A lot of machines that are coming out too, they're allowing you to make small batches of injection molding based on, like vacuum technology or some miniaturized technology that allows you to vertically integrate. I think industries in general, and there's a whole spiel here of like the sort of consultants making their way into boardrooms that really sell the whole, management theory of operations is that vertical integration, it's much more practical now than it ever has. Like people have access to information, to tooling, to systems that just allow you to do everything by yourself. And I think, and then I'll cut off the answer there and ask if you have any follow-ups.
Yeah, I mean, the flip side of the question is, if vertical integration is so useful in terms of, or so like doable now, with the advent of tools that allow for easy transfer of information from one system to another, then the flip side or the corollary of the question that I just asked is, why is there so much outsourcing as far as you or Vile understands from the like incumbent standpoint?
So why is there a lot of outsourcing? Um, First and foremost, a lot of the vertical integration pieces appear more expensive than the outsourcing version. That's until you start amortizing things and start looking at things from a long term, which is that's a big part of the Vile story. It's not just about, doing it right now and making it work right now, but it's about over 5, 10, 20 years. How does your process influence the industry and the world as a whole? So obviously short term, investing in robotics, investing in, AI and all of these things, it's definitely more expensive than like hiring 100 low paid lab techs in a low cost locale to just do your discovery process for you and just brute force it with human labor, right? So there is a cost factor, but again, there's also the management factor, right? Like put yourself in the shoes of an executive who oversees the operation of 200 people somewhere in a low cost locale, right? Would you would you volunteer to reduce your influence by reducing your workforce uh, in order to make
Absolutely.
things better?
I'm joking. No, of course not.
Yeah, like as an executive, like are you basically gonna work yourself out of a job? The answer is no. So that should tell you a lot. And again, what I predict the future is gonna be is, I want to say in like about 3 to 5 years, when the industry finally clues into it, there's gonna be consultants from big firms who are gonna go into this, into these companies, and instead of the reverse story, which happened, I would say like a decade back, where it's like, hey, outsource this, outsource that. Now they're like, oh, it's time to insource this. It's time to insource that. And the circle of life goes on.
Mhm. No, I mean, looking towards the future and different comparisons with what Vile is doing with other companies overall. One of our previous interviews with what was with Dr. Neil Magikar of a 1-3 biotech company on the East Coast of North America. So basically, for the TLDR, they're fasting, they're cancer focused, and they use data of all sorts from papers, etc., to find a de-risked target indication pair to attempt to bring to market. So is a data driven approach to move the systems integration approach that Bile has been using further up the value chain that in comparison to what 1-3 has been proposing? Why and why not?
So it's actually kind of like two, I would say, parallel tracks. What I mean is, what I'm hearing from 1-3 Ventures again, like optimizing target strategy, which
Yep.
is in it, like that's actually like the highest upstream process, picking your target. What Vile's trying to do actually is almost making the concept in taking it to its platonic extreme. Obviously, we're not there yet, but taking it to its platonic extreme. What Vile is making enabled is almost rendering the concept of, oh, we have to optimize targets like obsolete, meaning like any target, no matter what target it is, using this generalized approach for drug discovery and brute forcing your way into success. Um, you don't have to prioritize your targets. You don't have to be smart about choosing your targets. You just pursue them all. You just parallelize your track and you just parallelize all of your operations, and you'll be able to like basically cure every single target in existence. And I think that's the difference. Now, we would probably be very, very big, customers of 1-3 Ventures. And honestly, I'm actually gonna look it up right after this call, because that sounds like something that we'd be very, very interested in partnering at this time while we're figuring out our scaling approach. But yeah, like that's kind of how I would explain it.
That's super interesting. But then if I think of other comparisons, one easy one, because you're a Vancouverite too, is the comparison with other teal associated players in the space, such as Abcelera. So what differentiates Vile from other similarly integrating or vertically integrating drug discovery groups?
We vertically integrate by default. So I think that's the biggest jump. The approach we've seen from other adjacent or like comparables is that they go with an approach where it's like, okay, like we'll optimize this one component, refine it, make it work really, really well, sell it as a standalone option, then move on to the next part of the stack. Our approach, by the way, that approach is actually a very smart engineer approach. It's very valid. I'm not saying that it's not valid, but we're approaching it from a different way where it's like, all right, let's build a whole thing vertically integrate everything and press go, right? Which again, the con there is obviously it's like our individual components and each part of step maybe not going to be as optimal. There's going to be some gaps, but again, it's a different way of looking at things. It's a different way of working through the problem. But yeah, we're a vertically integrated shop by default.
Mm-hmm.
In an ideal world, what changes need to happen to bring the way we conduct clinical trials today into the post-AI world?
I see. So if I'm hearing this question correctly, can we rephrase this as how does AI change clinical trials, or like what
I love it.
benefits
Yeah.
does AI bring to clinical trials? Yeah. So first and foremost, I think the more holistic way to see AI is it supercharges normal tasks. It's a force multiplier. You can see it as a full force multiplier rather than just a normal, like, no, just like any other piece of technology. AI is a force multiplier. So in the world where AI is, running the show, really the platonic ideal is that a patient walks in, no, not even walks in. A patient has their phone, right? They're sent drugs over the mail by a drone, maybe. Like they get shipped their experimental drugs, they take it, and they jot their responses down on a phone. And the AI takes care of everything from there. From, okay, you know what? Like, this patient's data says this. Maybe we need to do dose control, because dose control is a thing in experimental drugs, right? So, okay, like the AI says, let's do dose control. Oh, the data here is ready. Let's send it over to the FDA in real time. And in that ideal world, the FDA is already adopting technologies to be on the receiving end of live stream data. That's just like, hey, patients are filling data in. Like, we're able to monitor the holistic landscape of clinical trial drugs. With AI, it ensures the data integrity and quality of things, meaning as the patients themselves record their own data and, speak there, they're able to like say, oh, this data doesn't really make sense. There seems to be some sort of aberration. We probably need to ask the patient again, or, oh, this data seems to suggest this patient's about to get, hypertension or some sort of adverse event, right? Maybe we should like call in the emergency room because maybe there's an SAE happening right here and now. Again, to kind of like wrap that all in a bow, the platonic ideal of the post-AI world in clinical trials is that the AI themselves run the clinical trials. Are we close to that world? We're not that close to that world. There's a lot of functions that humans absolutely need to perform. There's a lot of processes that need to be done, but we're also not that far away. We're not that far away from AI running clinical trials. I say it'll be within our lifetimes that AI is running clinical trials.
What do you think is actually stopping us from getting to that?
What is stopping us from getting to a world where AI runs clinical trials? Well, there's a lot of answers. Obviously, there's a the technology still needs to get better. There's like accuracy of these models needs to get better. But I think the actual biggest hurdle is the trust. Like the trust in the technology of AI. Because nowadays you say AI and there's almost like this fear in people that it will replace jobs and that will rule the world. And, all of these horror stories, Terminator, Skynet, that's still all fresh in people's minds in terms of pop culture, despite, like Terminator being an old IP. I digress. The point is AI, like before, like even if AI was like as good as it could be today, for so long as the people and the masses don't trust the idea of letting computers run processes autonomously, this thing isn't going to happen. And what does it take for that to go through? It needs baby steps. We need to start introducing AI, and let's make it specific into the pharmaceutical and the biomedical industry. We need to start introducing AI into smaller stakes processes, but let it exist, right? Like try to just experiment on low stakes. And for us, like plugging in Vial, one of the things that we do is checking for error ranges and correctness of data with AI. That's something that we're experimenting on with less critical trials in phase 3, like basically like your pre-phase 1 trials, your non-phase trials. Like we're trying out AI data management because, okay, the stakes are low. We're starting to build the trust. We're starting to demonstrate, okay, AI is more than capable of doing this. for the early stages of drug discovery, for like virtual screening and choosing your initial drug candidates. There's not a lot of money at stake yet. It's time to like really just, introduce those into the processes. And sooner or later, the people are going to see, okay, this isn't that bad. What's the next step? Right? All right, let's introduce data here. Oh, okay. That wasn't bad. That was pretty good. Let's introduce data here. It's kind of the same as like computers and cloud technology. I can imagine if you introduce computers to like the clinical trial world back in, I don't know, 1990s, they'd be like, oh, like that data isn't secure because it's in a screen. It's not real. I would prefer to just have my data written down. Um, Stuff like that.
It's only secure if it's through fax, Miguel.
Yes. Yes. 100%.
Um,
I kind of want to bring it back to your experience like throughout Vial, just the day-to-day of engineering. What do you think changed from your experience from the time you started off with Vial to now as the VP? Because I think you've grown within, right?
Yeah, I think the very short answer is I don't code anymore. So I barely look at technical stuff anymore, and I do. There is a bit of I do miss it a lot, but nowadays I find my day to day a lot of decision making, um, a lot of weighing in on options and weighing in on decisions that fundamentally affect or shape the trajectory of the company. And a lot of people think there's this thing that people say about like, the higher up you go in management or being an executive, the less you do, or kind of like, the like you're basically just, telling people orders around. Um, that's partially true. I actually don't even know what I do some days, and some days it almost feels like I do nothing and I accomplish nothing. And I'm basically a big L on the balance sheet. But in all seriousness, a lot of it is basically answering questions that nobody has answers to. It sounds very fundamental, and it does absolutely sound like what an executive would say if he wants to keep his job kind of answer. But the truth is, there's also the aspect of taking responsibility for the decisions. As much as people like, or as much as I like to believe as an IC, when I started getting into the workforce, like working for a real company, I thought I was like, hey, I want to take accountability for everything. I want to drive all the decisions and do things, especially as a fresher grad or like somebody who's younger. The reality is that stuff's scary. Being able to having to answer for decisions that could cost like tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands, millions of dollars. That's a big responsibility to bear. And as an executive, as a VP, my job is to say, yep, that like $1 million move that we made, I'm signing off on it and I'm taking full responsibility of that. And I think fundamentally that's a big change. And I've been fortunate to have experienced this in such a short burst. So I'm able to like really like compare and contrast. But yeah, it's really just about that, being able to take responsibility and accountability for decisions that, the team and the company as a whole make.
Do you have any advice to someone that's starting out?
Advice for somebody who's starting out. The biggest piece of advice that I've come around to is take the best opportunity and take the best shot that's in front of you today. Basically, there's always this meta where it's like, oh, like wait for the best, like wait for your shot to come up and it'll happen. Or like, hey, kind of like postpone until you see the best option. But more often than not, being decisive, and I'm not saying like, hey, you get a job offer, just take it like right now, like type of vibe, but make your decisions not based on what could be, but what is. Make your decisions based on what benefits you today and what brings you the most benefit today. Because the reality of things is like time in the market beats timing the market, right? The more decisions you make, the more actions you take in order to progress your career, even if it's not the suboptimal decision, taken as a whole, it may compound to something better. It may compound to something that actually leads to that big thing, while at the same time giving you that benefit today. Like, for example, when I was starting out and like, exiting my company, my startup that I founded pre-COVID, I didn't want to be in engineering. I thought I wanted to go into product management, but there were more engineering roles open at the time and it was more rewarding. So I said, you know what? I'm just going to go into an engineering role. And then that just snowballed. If I had waited for a product management role to kind of go in, there's no telling if I would have compounded myself this fast, because just those fast decisions allowed me to just like quickly rise through ranks. And when you apply that to your whole life about like, oh, do we use this stack or this stack? Which this stack, this looks really good and looks really ideal, but there's some missing features. I would choose the stack that has complete features and that gives me benefit today rather than like take a flyer on something that's completely experimental, right? It's still innovation. It's still something new, but I don't need to min-max that. I just need to make the call, get the benefits, rinse, repeat every single day. And I think that's what I would change when I like to when I was younger. That's what I would say to anyone who's starting out.
And last, just to close off, I usually give our guests an opportunity to share things that they're working on that they like to share. Anything that you'd like to plug for yourself or for your company?
I would like to plug in the fact that Vial is continuously hiring. We're almost always hiring for new roles, new interesting things to work on. So if you visit us at vial.com/careers, that like it will usually almost always have an open role there. It's evolving all the time. We're scaling very, very fast. We're opening up new opportunities almost on a weekly basis. So if you're interested in working in a high growth, high velocity, very innovative company that's tackling drug development from its very beginning towards its very end, give us a shout. Take a look at our careers page. We'd be happy to, receive your application. And yeah, that's my plug.
All right. Thank you so much. Till next time.